Welcome, everyone. We will be starting in just a couple of minutes. Thank you all for joining us. All right, good morning, everyone. It's 11 a.m. and welcome to Netroots Nation and to our panel, Public Ownership, Understanding and Seizing the Momentum. My name is Isaiah J. Poole, and I am editorial manager at the Democracy Collaborative in Washington, D.C. And I'm excited to moderate this panel today with three strong, smart organizers who are not only leading critically important political campaigns, but are changing the way we think about who should control the basic services we need for our well-being. But before I do that, let's talk about Nebraska. Now, I've never been to Nebraska, but those of you who have lived in Nebraska for any length of time probably know something that's a bit of a secret to the rest of the country. And that is that every resident and business in Nebraska receives its power from a publicly owned utility. That's right, not a single watt of electricity is supplied by a private company. In fact, there are 166 public electric utilities in Nebraska that together serve a state of close to 2 million people. Now, these utilities are structured in various ways. Some are cooperatives, others are more like nonprofit enterprises. But they are all sworn to prioritize the public interest as they deliver electricity. They are not beholden to shareholders who demand high stock prices and dividends, and to get those are willing to cut corners on service or charge some customers more than they can possibly afford. Now, we keep being told that only privately run companies can efficiently deliver a service like electricity to customers. But Nebraska's network of public utilities proves them wrong every single day. Not only is Nebraska's electricity delivery rated as among the most reliable in the country, but the residential rates are cheaper in Nebraska than they are in all but 5 other states. And yet, even with those low rates, Nebraska's utilities have been able to return more than $100 million a year to state and local governments. Now, the reason I bring up Nebraska is to point out that public ownership, public control of the essential services that we need and use every day is not a radical idea. It's not even a radical idea in the United States. It is true that decades of well-funded propaganda from businesses and conservative political interests have tried to convince us that public institutions cannot run anything well. It's failed socialism, they call it. And that the titans of Wall Street and Silicon Valley are the only ones who should be given more control over the essentials that we depend on. Yet, as Thomas M. Hanna, who is my colleague at the Next System Project at the Democracy Collaborative, has written in the book, Our Commonwealth, The Return of Public Ownership in the United States, there is ample evidence in our history and in our current experience that public ownership works, and it works better than the privatization schemes that have been rammed down our throats since the Reagan and Clinton eras. And that evidence, a lot of which, by the way, you will see at our Next System Project website, thenextsystem.org. That evidence should encourage us as we push for bold solutions that will make our country more equitable, more sustainable, and more responsive to the needs of all of us. We, the people, in fact, can create and manage institutions and enterprises that serve us, not extract from us. The three people on our panel are advancing that view by leading local campaigns in the areas of energy, banking, and housing. Their experience will offer inspiration and insight into how we can reimagine how our economy should work and how we can together build that new world that we imagine. So each of our panelists will tell you a little bit about themselves and their work, and we're going to have ample opportunity for questions afterwards. And when you want to ask questions, please put them in the Q&A button that's on the at the bottom of your Zoom window. And if also feel free to use the chat to chat among yourselves and to exchange ideas as we go along. Now I'm going to turn it over to Trinity Tran.
Great, thanks, Isaiah. So happy to be here. I'm Trinity Tran. I'm the co-founder of California Public Banking Alliance, Public Bank LA, and Divest LA. I started my fight against Wall Street in 2017 by launching the Divest LA campaign, which mobilized activists to take on Wells Fargo, the second largest bank in the nation, and divest our city funds from Los Angeles. And within a year, we won the campaign and leveraged that political moment into the public banking movement to divest from Wall Street altogether. 2018, I founded Public Bank Los Angeles, and we initiated the Measure B campaign to create a city bank for Los Angeles, which then led to over 430,000 Angelinos voting yes for a public bank. I'm also a founding member of the California Public Banking Alliance and lead organizer. The Alliance is a statewide organization of activists representing 10 cities. And last year, we passed the groundbreaking AB 857 Public Banking Act to create local public banks in California, which Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law last year. So with that, I'll start my presentation. Really appreciate Democracy Collaborative and Netroots Nation for spotlighting public banking as an important part of the public ownership movement and our grassroots work here in the state to create the first state public bank in a century in the United States. So it's very exciting. Public banking is something that's been quietly revolutionizing finance just over the past few years through our grassroots work here to transform the banking system from one that's based on greed and extraction to a publicly owned banking system where capital and credit can be actually used to help our communities rather than harm our communities, rather than used to fund harmful industries like private prisons and immigrant detention centers and fossil fuel projects. We can actually use money to build things that we need. So it's ultimately about redirecting the flow of money to benefit the public good. And we're excited about all of the momentum building around this space. So in this brief presentation, 5 slides, I'll explain what a public bank is. I'll talk about AB 857, the Public Banking Act, the landmark bill we passed last year, and why public banks are needed, especially now more than ever as we're dealing with the economic fallout from COVID-19 pandemic, which has really severely impacted the livelihoods of working people across the nation. I'll also talk about some of the exciting developments at the state level. Our new bill in the California state legislature, AB 310, to create a state public bank, and how a state bank is a crucial vehicle to bring about a recovery process for the people of California, especially in hard-hit communities of color. And so just a little bit of background, it's been one hugely groundbreaking year for the movement. This is essentially a really new movement that's arisen like within the last few years. So, you know, as I briefly touched on, in 2019, it was about 9 months ago, an all volunteer team of organizers from California with the California Public Banking Alliance challenged the Wall Street status quo and defeated banking lobbyists by passing AB 857, which paves a way for cities, counties, and regions in California to be able to form their own banks. And this is a bank, a public bank that's accountable to the people, that's capable of providing a return that gets reinvested back into our communities and redirected towards ethical and sustainable developments. Because at the end of the day, taking the power back from private mega banks and putting it in the hands of the people is a crucial and a very necessary step forward for social and economic justice. So as Governor Newsom signed our bill, which then legalized public banking in California for the first time in history. And passing that bill really accelerated movements to take on Wall Street in dozens of cities and states across the country. So the Public Banking Act was a big step forward in radically transforming the financial system from an extractive, profit-based private model to a public model. And the momentum that's been building, you know, we're now here at a revolutionary moment in history to be able to truly transform finance and to create a real and viable path forward for the public banking movement to create the People's Bank. So with that, I'll start my first slide. So what's a public bank? So a public bank is a financial institution that's owned by a public entity that's either a city, a state, or a joint powers authority. And a public bank makes the cost of debt cheaper for the city or state. So it does that by buying and issuing debt below market because it has ability to access low-cost lending from the Fed. And there are two important distinctions between public and private banks. One, unlike private commercial banks, the interest and profit for a public bank belongs to the community. So instead of billions of our tax dollars getting siphoned out of our communities by Wall Street banks, a public bank allows us to be able to, allows our state or our localities or cities to be able to recapture the interest we pay to bondholders and recirculate that money back into the local economies. And public banks are formed with social benefit purposes, which means they are required to invest in and lend to the communities they serve. And that is a very important part of public banking is local self-control. So deposits are made locally, the investments are made locally, the decision-making process on investments are made locally. That allows us to be able to keep our money local and become self-sufficient. Just imagine what it would be like to be able to reinvest our public funds, our tax dollars back into our communities. We would then be able to address things like affordable housing and green energy infrastructure and small business loans in historically underserved areas. The other distinction is that unlike private banks, public banks do not compete with community banks and credit unions. So similar to the Bank of North Dakota model, which is the only public bank in the United States, public banks have a partnership relationship with smaller banks, and they work with them to extend their credit line so that they can offer low-cost consumer benefits. We're advocating for wholesale banks. So these banks would become the main depository for cities and regions. We're not competing with customers with community banks and credit unions. Why do we need public banks? So the focus of our fight with public banking is to create a just, a viable alternative to Wall Street. Right now, cities, counties, states hold billions of dollars of our public money in Wall Street banks. And these corporate banks, they essentially own and control this money, which they have, again, used to finance industries that our communities and our activists actively fight against. So that's our taxpayer dollars being used to fund these destructive sectors. So it's about taking the power back and putting it squarely into the hands of the people. And just an important side note, because our work with public banking really stemmed from the divestment movement that really rose across the nation in 2017 in solidarity with Standing Rock and Indigenous people who are fighting against oil pipelines that were being built on their sacred lands, and pipelines being financed by big banks. So our divestment efforts from activists in California, from Los Angeles to San Francisco to Santa Rosa to Alameda County, evolved into the public banking movement to divest city, county dollars from these predatory Wall Street banks. Instead of divesting from one predatory bank and moving those public funds to another behemoth Wall Street bank, public bank empowers our cities and counties to divest from Wall Street altogether, and create a bank that is 100% accountable to the people and planet. So hence our tagline with Public Bank LA is our money, our values, our bank. Another reason why we need public banks is private Wall Street banks charge our local governments large fees to hold deposits and perform cash management services. So this is money that is being extracted out of our communities to line the pockets of out-of-state private shareholders and bankers. Another benefit of public banking is to maximize tax dollars. So right now, nearly 50% of all of our infrastructure costs goes towards paying bank interest and fees. So if we were able to fund public projects ourselves, we could literally cut the cost of infrastructure in half. If we cut it in half, that means we double our power to invest in our own cities. And what does that mean? That means more money to build bridges and roads and schools. That's more money to rebuild our communities. So we see public banking as a common sense and a logical solution for cities and states to have financial independence from private mega banks. Public Banking Act. So this is the historic bill we passed in 2019. Our merry band of volunteer heroes took on Wall Street and won. So AB 857 provides a pathway for local governments and joint powers authorities to be able to start public banks. It creates a framework for public banks to be regulated. And the public banks framework that we created under 857 will have the same financial and regulatory requirements as commercial banks. So, the reason why we decided to create a state bill was, instead of activists in cities across California fighting to create their own public banks, what we did was we banded together as an alliance of advocates, and we created one bill that would streamline the process for cities and counties across the state to potentially create a network of socially and environmentally responsible local public banks. So the AB 857 public banks, like credit unions, will be exempt from taxes. Like public agencies, they will be subject to the Brown Act and the Public Records Act. That's going to ensure that the banks are going to be transparent, run with good governance, and have a real commitment to public interest. AB 857 public banks will require FDIC insurance and collateralization. There's also a multi-step process before a public bank license is granted. So the first step, the local agency has to create a business plan, what's also called a viability study, and that business plan has to be voted on and approved by the local governing body, then submitted to the California Department of Business Oversight, then the FDIC. So there's multiple steps that cities and localities will have to take before a public bank is started, but this creates the framework for that. And the bill was implemented as a pilot program. So it's intended that after a successful pilot program, we will work to make the law permanent so that all California communities can benefit from public banks. This was a really exciting bill because, as mentioned, it was a coalition of volunteers Unfunded, by the way. This was an unfunded effort that challenged Wall Street and won by creating a network, creating a statewide network of citizens lobbyists. And a really broad-based coalition, including the biggest labor unions in the state of California, national orgs like American Postal Workers Union and Our Revolution, and over 200 statewide, regional, and local organizations in support of public banks. And it was the political capital that we built behind this bill that helped move public banking as something that was, you know, kind of fringe and esoteric and unknown, and like further into the realm of respectable public policy, which then really helped spur a national movement. Last slide. COVID-19 and public banking. So extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. So 9 months ago, we passed the Public Banking Act. And then over 4.5 months ago, COVID-19 happened. And that's really that stalled some of the efforts with public banking locally, because cities and counties across the state are now heading towards record-breaking budget deficits. So the question that we were faced in the last few months is how do we help fill in the budget gaps, the state's budget gaps, to A, ensure that we have a health recovery, B, help small businesses who are shut out of federal PPP programs. How do we help small businesses, especially businesses in communities of color, get back on their feet? How do we, be able to use this moment to create affordable housing, build infrastructure, distribute assistance to people who need it most, the most vulnerable? That's when we started brainstorming the AB 310 bill to create a California state public bank. So AB 310 would create a state bank that's owned by Californians, not Wall Street. The bank would leverage the state's money to be able to create loans by allocating a small portion of the state's checking account into the existing state infrastructure bank, and which then allows the bank to become the California State Public Bank. And this is going to help provide local governments with the money they need to be able to support communities as we're in the midst of this budget crisis, the deficit crisis. So the AB 310 is what a public bank can do is that it can leverage its existing funds up to 10 times to be able to provide economic recovery. At a moment when we need funding the most, a public bank will be able to help us do this faster, more efficiently. This is a real vehicle towards rebuilding and recovering for not only for the state of California, but for communities and states across the nation. So the bill was introduced just last month. It was a gut and amend of an existing bill, and because it took us a few months to kind of brainstorm, this idea. So it was a gut amend. The bill was introduced last month, but so what happened was, because of a truncated legislative timeline because of COVID-19, a lot of bills were getting held. So AB 310, what we did within the last 2 weeks was really incredible, because we knew that the bill would likely not be heard, because only about 100 of the few thousand bills would be heard. But we built political support with the California State Treasurer and the State Controller. So the State Treasurer, Fiona Ma, State Controller, Betty Yee, have actually now stated on the record that they will be working with us when we're back in hearings in the fall. Along with the chair of the Senate Governance Committee, Senator Mike McGuire. They have all committed to working with advocates on our AB 310 bill, which is so exciting. So now we have a few more months to build up the organization, continue building the coalition. So we'll be back in hearings in the fall, followed by a reintroduction of the bill at the beginning of the year in January. So we're extremely excited, especially to have the support of the state treasurer of the 5th largest economy in the world behind the state bank idea. And this is ultimately the bold solution that we need, because as we're seeing not only in California, but in states across the nation, essential services are going to be slashed. Small business are failing. it's going to be difficult for communities to survive this pandemic. Nationally, over 40% of Black-owned businesses now have actually closed their doors because of the pandemic. So now is our moment to revolutionize finance and to create the People's Bank. And because there's no quick path towards, there's no path towards quick recovery. We're in a state of emergency, and that is why the COVID-19 crisis makes a really strong case for public banking, because we need to create a financial institution that invests in our communities, where our public funds can stay local and be leveraged to finance immediate, just, and equitable recovery for the people of California. So just to quickly wrap up, I've said this is a revolutionary moment many times, but it really is for the public banking, because just from the bill last year, that's then spurred local efforts from LA to SF, San Francisco to East Bay to Central Coast Regional Bank. And then across the nation, the Victory in California ignited movements in Washington, in New Mexico, in Massachusetts, and Mississippi, and even inspired states like Colorado and Illinois to also create a public banking alliance. And New York recently introduced a bill to create a state bank. And we also formed the National Public Banking Alliance to be able to join forces and help amplify the movement. So now's our moment to fundamentally transform finance, and to be able to create a sustainable and a regenerative future for communities across the country. We have to take our monetary power back from outside interest through local control of our public dollars, moving it from a private banking system based on extraction to a public model where interest and profit belongs to the community and wealth gets reinvested. So with that, that ends my PowerPoint. The sun is glaring in my face. Let me close my curtains.
Mari Rose, you're next.
Wonderful. Good morning, everybody from Ohlone Territory, also known as Oakland, California. So I'm Mary Rose Taruk. I'm the coordinator of the Reclaim Our Power Utility Justice Campaign. I have 25 years of community organizing history, where I have helped pull together 3 of the biggest climate justice coalitions in California, including one that has successfully been able to channel billions of dollars for climate projects in disadvantaged communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and immigrant and communities of color in California. So I am going to share my slides. Let's see. All right. So the Reclaim Our Power campaign is the largest coalition in California campaigning for utility justice. And we represent tens of thousands of Californians from environmental justice, wildfire survivor, disability justice, local clean energy, and youth groups to move us away from the disastrous private corporate model, the private corporate utility model that is under PG&E, the Pacific Gas and Electric Company. And right now, as we're at home mostly, sheltering in place with Netroots. Thank you, Netroots, for this panel and inviting me to be on. What this pandemic is illuminating for us is that what in our Reclaim Our Power campaign believe is that energy is a human right. Just like food and water, the way our society works right now is that electricity needs to be part of the public domain, and that energy should not be a commodity that's privately sold only to those who can afford it, because we do need power to live. There are folks who, especially those who rely on breathing machines and other medical equipment, who need power to live. And we cannot allow private corporations to determine whether people live or die based on their ability to pay for electricity. And as we're seeing this shelter in place, that we're needing to work and go to school from our homes, and that they need to be powered with electricity. And so to do this, we need to take our energy system out of private hands and into democratic control, designed for frontline communities that are Black, Indigenous, people of color, particularly, so that we can adapt to the crisis of wildfires under climate change. I should also say that right now in the San Francisco Bay Area, some cities are gonna hit 110 degrees, and that's not really normal for us. And the heat combined with the many years of drought that California is in make for our wildfire season really scary. And for PG&E, who controls the electricity for the northern half of California and all the millions of people in this northern half of the state, if what they do is they prioritize investor and shareholder profit over public health and public safety. And so when are we going to wake up to the fact that we need to change that dynamic? And so that's what our campaign is about, and that's how we've been organizing in this last year. That it's a necessary thing in the climate crisis. So, what are problems with privately controlled electric utility? Not just under PG&E, but we're hearing across the country. There are fires and smokeouts and shutoffs happening all over. So in 2018, when this campaign, the idea for this campaign started, 86 people were killed by PG&E because of their faulty equipment that ignited the fire that devastated and razed the town of Paradise in Northern California. They have been found to be guilty of, PG&E has been found to be guilty of manslaughter for all of those people, and has caused them a lot of damage claims that they have to pay for. And the terrible thing is that as a private corporation, they're trying to pass that off to their customers, people like me, the rest of us, to pay for that instead of their shareholders. And that structure of a private corporation is what we're having to grapple with. We don't want to be burned down, smoked out, shut off, poisoned, or bankrupted by PG&E. Northern California has had 100 years of this private corporation, and in the rapid acceleration of their collapse, they're trying to take us down with them, and we're fighting back. So I talked about the fires that have raged because of PG&E prioritizing shareholder profits over the money that they were supposed to set aside to change out their equipment, the wires and the poles that are falling down, vegetation management, all of that. And also when the fires in the areas are starting, or they see that happening, last year they put millions of their customers under power shutoffs. So they cut off electricity and couldn't tell us when they were going to turn that back on. And so that the disaster that created, especially for people, again, on medical equipment who rely on electricity to power their machines to live, did not know when their power was going to come on. And so PG&E, in their behind the scenes were in charge of like who got their power shut off and determine when it could come back on. And there was no public control of that. And we want to change that. Also, with environmental justice communities in California, we know where the dirty power plants are, and those are in Black, Brown, Indigenous communities across the state. And we have been campaigning for decades to get rid of them and change it out to clean, renewable technology. And so PG&E has tried to avoid that. They tried to delay as much as they can in changing out those dirty power plants. And so if it was under public control, we could, that timeline could be accelerated. And then what I talked about with bankruptcy is that, so in 2019, PG&E filed for bankruptcy as a way for them to avoid paying the billions of dollars in wildfire claims for the people and the towns and the places that they burned down. And so they got bailed out by the state of California to the tune of at least $10 billion. And it's like, what could we do with 10 billion to create the infrastructure for us to have clean, renewable energy for communities that are publicly controlled, that can adapt to climate change, because there are technologies and ways that we can do that right now. We've seen it happen. When Isaiah opened the panel and talked about, there are publicly owned and publicly run utilities in this country. California also has public utilities. So if you live in Los Angeles, your utility is run by public government. The LA Department of Water and Power is a public agency. If you live in Sacramento, our state capital in California, your electricity is run by a public entity. And so it's not unusual that that our energy could be run by a public institution. It's already happening. And so let's see, next slide. So our vision for frontline community and worker controlled energy system is that we have to oppose these billion-dollar bailouts of private corporations like PG&E. We need to democratize our energy governance, and we need to restructure our energy system that is fit for the people and people's needs and community needs. Just a month or two ago, we actually passed this law called Golden State Energy. And the Reclaim Our Power campaign was right there testifying as an expert witness about why we need to switch to a model for the state to run our utility in Northern California that is not in private hands. And so Golden State Energy would be the entity that, the utility that would be put in place if PG&E fails again and burns down places and kills people. The bad thing is PG&E has to kill and burn down all of those people and places before Golden State Energy would be established. So we think that's the wrong way to approach it. We could actually do that. We could have an alternative energy utility system right now. What would we want instead? So here's the Reclaim Our Power chart about our vision for utility justice. We already know the status quo. For ownership, we want community and worker controlled utility. And I have to talk about what public ownership means. So to move away from a private corporation into one that's controlled by the state or communities, there are actually multiple structures to do that. It could be run by the state. We could have a cooperative run it, and it's not a government entity. We could have a nonprofit run it. So Golden State Energy, the law that just passes actually says it would be a nonprofit that would run it. Who knows how to run nonprofits? Like, how many of us have worked in nonprofit organizations or corporations? Like, I think a lot of social justice folks know exactly how nonprofits work. And so it's not like it's a far-fetched idea how to run a nonprofit or a cooperative. Like a lot of our, we have a lot of banks that are cooperatively owned, and we need to have and learn this, this governance muscle. And so with governance, we know that when PG&E shut off the power to millions of Californians, that they were deciding what exactly that was on their own by their shareholders. And we want that to be in the hands of the public about what public safety means and how we provide for people with medical devices that they have continuous power. And that we want the system to be decentralized. I think what the corporate model tries to do is they try to centralize power and profit altogether. And we want to decentralize that where different, and there's different energy systems that can actually act as energy islands or microgrids where they're interconnected within a place and they can turn that switch on and have continuous power, and that, you know, there's not just solar generation, but batteries that can sustain that, and that they're interconnected within their local areas. So those are community energy resilience is part of that, the solution for us in the campaign. And I will close by saying I've been working on solutions to the climate crisis for a long time now, and we know that our industrial systems are collapsing. And if we're talking about a just transition from an extractive economy to a generative one, our communities need to be ready to govern our resources and be there to put the new systems in that we need. And just as a last plug, the Reclaim Our Power campaign is holding a summit in mid-September. And I'm gonna put our website on the chat and you can find us there. So thank you.
Thank you. I want to apologize to Tara because the entire panel, we only have about 10 minutes. So Tara, if please go ahead.
I'll be quick. I'll be quick. Thanks, Isaiah. And thank you to the incredible panelists who have joined me on this call. I'm so excited to be here. I'm really grateful to Netroots Nation and to the Democracy Collaborative. And I've learned a ton about public banks and public utilities. So thank you to the other panelists. My name is Tara Raghavir, and I'm the Homes Guarantee Campaign Director at People's Action, which is a national network of grassroots organizations working on racial, economic, gender, and climate justice. And the Homes Guarantee is a campaign with a simple premise. We live in the richest country in the history of the world. We can and we must guarantee that everyone has a home, period. This is a simple premise, but of course one that is complicated, if not seemingly impossible to implement in an America that, by a conspiracy of the profiteers, has considered housing completely privatized for more than 5 decades. The Homes Guarantee is a campaign that actually aims to transform housing from commodity to public good. Right now, of course, our country falls woefully short of delivering on this promise. And I'll begin by contextualizing the current housing crisis through the stories of 4 of the leaders who actually shaped the vision for what we now know to be the Homes Guarantee. Tiana Caldwell is a tenant in Kansas City who's the descendant of slaves. She's the granddaughter and daughter of veterans who did not benefit from the GI Bill. She grew up in poverty in Parsons, Kansas. Tiana was diagnosed with ovarian cancer last spring and forced to choose between her treatments or paying rent. And ultimately, her landlord evicted her, her family became homeless, and they started spending $300 to $500 a week to live in a hotel for 6 months. Vernell Robinson is a public housing resident in Far Rockaway, Queens. Vernell survived Superstorm Sandy and experienced undrinkable water and mold after the storm worsened the city's already crumbling public housing. David Zoltan was injured on a job. He lost a leg and discovered that less than 1% of all apartments in Chicago where he lives are both affordable and accessible. He finally found an accessible place to live, but it cost him $1,050 a month, and his monthly disability check is only $950. And then finally, Jermaine Abdullah got out of prison and he lived in a homeless shelter for 3 years. The shelter was filthy, the roof leaked, and roaches crawled on the sink and toilet seats. To Jermaine, the shelter felt like prison all over again. And I share these stories as a way of grounding us. These stories are not isolated or extreme, but rather very typical outcomes of America's systemic and racialized housing emergency. America's land and housing policy since the earliest days of this settler state has been built on theft, extraction, and exclusion. Our housing policies, like our banks, like our power systems, are designed for profits and not for people. And in 2020, a full-time worker earning minimum wage cannot afford a 2-bedroom apartment in any county in America, urban, suburban, or rural. 12 million households spend over half their income on the rent every month. And the public system has been completely decimated in the last several decades. This is not a story of a functioning private market. This is a story of vast, brutal market failure that comes at the cost of human lives. And of course, that failure is all the more pronounced now during a raging pandemic where tens of millions were laid off, people got sick, and kids were sent home from school. In the absence of a vaccine, housing was the prescription. Housing was the prescription. We were all told to stay home in order to keep ourselves and our neighbors healthy and safe. But for so many people, that was never an option. As we speak, tenants are being evicted all over the country, evicted out of their homes, onto the streets. In my hometown in Kansas City, tenants are being evicted both in person at the courts, putting them at risk of exposure to coronavirus, as well as by conference call, a gross violation of due process rights. With every eviction that we allow right now, we are saying that we believe that landlords' profits are more important than people's lives. But we have a vision for a different and better world. We have a vision for a world where housing is guaranteed as a public good and a human right. The federal government has not made this type of investment in housing in decades, really since the New Deal. And now we actually need action far beyond that scale to meet the country's housing crisis, which is completely untenable right now. We need a homes guarantee that will build tens of millions of units of social housing that's permanently off of the private market and in public control. We need to reinvest in existing public housing. We need to protect renters and bank tenants. We need to pay reparations for centuries of racist land and housing policies. And finally, we need to decommodify housing once and for all. That is, transform housing from a commodity into a public good. And fully realize this proposal will guarantee that every person in this country is housed. I would like to say that our idea and our vision for a homes guarantee is not as far advanced as the campaigns that you heard about in California, which are so inspiring and have already won some substantial victories. But I think we see ourselves at the beginning of a process, and we're taking notes from those types of campaigns to figure out how we actualize this transformation into housing as a public good, because we know that this is not a radical idea. It's an economic, political, and moral necessity.
Thank you. Want to thank all three of what you've heard in the last 35 minutes or so are, dare I say, three badass females who are really taking us into a new generation of activism and a new level of thinking about, how we should be relating to these essential services like banking, like housing, like energy. We only have space for maybe one or two questions. One question I want to lay out and want to give each of you about 30 seconds or so to respond. Have you found that the COVID-19 crisis has changed the receptivity on the ground to expanding public ownership in the areas where you're working? Either one of you can start.
I'll start quickly. I think what we've noticed is that the potential for base building for the Homes Guarantee campaign is almost limitless right now, as so many people are feeling the dire impact of the privatization of housing that, of course, has existed for a long time, has disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities for a long time. But now we're starting to see it impact tens of millions of more workers who were laid off during this pandemic. So the potential for base building around a vision for a homes guarantee feels limitless. Though I will say, I think the lack of imagination at every level of government to actually address housing insecurity during the pandemic doesn't bring me a lot of hope in this particular moment. I still think it's a long fight, even as the public is starting to come around to the idea that the market has failed and we need a better way.
Yeah, if I can jump in, absolutely. With banking, you know, what we're seeing in California is we're now faced with a $54 billion deficit. So with a deficit, with a record-breaking deficit, essential services are going to get cut, and all across our communities, all across the state, we are going to feel the effects of this pandemic. And that is why, you know, this is our bill is was created as an emergency action to infuse needed capital into local governments, into small businesses who are going to need help. You know, 40% of the businesses that I've shuttered across the nation are Black-owned businesses. So you're seeing that communities of color are getting shut out of assistance from the federal government. All of the federal PPP loans were, much of it was going towards corporations and big businesses. So, you know, the real need for capital is there to be able to rebuild our communities, to be able to rebuild it in a way that's just, that's equitable, requires us to be able to take the power of money back into our hands to be able to rebuild California.
Mm-hmm. And I talked about how, yeah, and shelter in place for this, for our panel to happen, for Netroots to happen, we need electricity to be running to do that. And our electricity bills are even higher now, right? Because we're using so much more of it. And there is this, it's like, how can people, especially low-income people, afford to keep up with the higher utility bills? And so we're having to look at, like, you know, if we had a publicly run or community controlled utility, that we would have a plan for how to provide that safely and affordably to people without thinking about shareholder profits, that we would be in the service of the public to be able to do that. And as you know, folks were calling for eviction moratoriums across the country, there are folks who are also calling for utility shutoff moratoriums so that people can still have power to be able to live their lives. And also some places, rural places, they rely on electricity for water to run. And so if you can't wash your hands with water to run because there's no electricity, then we cannot keep safe under these pandemic conditions.
There we go. Let me add to what Murray Rose was saying. Let's talk about broadband also. We didn't get a chance to talk extensively about that, but as we're also working from home and running up our electricity bills, we're running up our broadband bills as well. And we see the consequences of inadequate broadband when we have children in our communities who can't access learning opportunities from home, or people can't work adequately from home because they do not have high-speed broadband. So I want to put that on the table. Our Next System project at the Democracy Collaborative, by the way, has recently issued a report that you can find on the nextsystem.org that speaks to the opportunities for public ownership in broadband and in telecommunications generally. I am also, we have just one just a couple more minutes. A questioner wants to know, what is the benefit of a public bank over a credit union? Go ahead.
A public bank, especially the model that we're creating, is a depository for cities and states. So credit unions usually typically have assets of about $1 billion. So a public bank would be able to bank municipalities, would be able to bank local governments, and would be able to finance large infrastructure projects. So essentially a public bank is a credit union for a city or municipality or region.
Thank you for that. In the time that we have left, we're in this tricky political environment where there are a lot of progressive energy is on the ground. At the national level, though, the alternative that we have to vote for is actually a very centrist alternative, is not the kind of transformative alternative that we've been talking about on this panel. Nonetheless, what do you think is the secret of advancing these campaigns in the moment, either in terms of talking about them, which I think is important, or in terms of organizing people? Just in just a couple of words, starting with Mary Rose, if you could each give me a quick insight into how we move forward.
Mm-hmm. I think the gift and the crisis from the federal government not being able to have its shit together is that our ability to see ourselves as governing locally, county-wide, statewide, has forced us into that position even more, and calls to our ideas for how to govern and what would we govern, what kinds of resources. And I think the crisis of climate change, as I said, has also called to us to figure out which resources are essential. COVID also has begged that question about what is essential to us, and how do we make sure that those resources are governed for the public good. And so all these questions are like deep rooted, like soul searching, like how would we do that? And now is the time to do that. And let's put forward these big ideas, because that's what we need, both to run our cities, our places, our country, and under the climate crisis.
Trinity?
Yes. I'm excited about this conversation because I mean, what we're seeing not only with amazing panelists on this panel, but I think what we're seeing across the nation is like a real awakening towards the need to shift away from privatization of services towards public ownership. So whether that's banking, whether that's broadband, utilities, healthcare, housing, these are basic human necessities that contribute to the well-being of society as a whole. So they need to be in the hands of the people rather than left to the whims of the private sector and private shareholders. Just as we can't depend on private developers to address the basic human need for housing, just like we can't depend on fossil fuel executives to take us to net zero carbon. And they simply don't have the incentive to build, to design for the greater good, for the sustainability of this earth. So this is a pivotal moment in history to transform the economy into a human-centered system. That's more focused on maximizing the impact of profit, but rather than just maximizing profit. So the question is, how do we take this global pause that we're in, this pandemic, and how do we seize this moment so that we can restructure the system? And I think it starts from a local first approach, because it's much easier to create progressive change at the local level, at the municipal level, at the state level, especially in more progressive cities and states, than it is to change things at the federal level. So I think our aim needs to be to create a local model for public ownership, for public banking, for public housing, for public utilities that can then be used as as a blueprint for the rest of the nation to follow.
Tara, you've got about 30 seconds or so. Almost the last word.
Yeah, I love what Mary Rose was saying about how this pandemic has taught us about how equipped we are to self-govern. I think mutual aid networks, like the networks that Trinity, I know, runs out in California, that we're running in Kansas City, that so many other communities have stepped up to run, show us what's possible when we take matters into our own hands, when our government fails us, and when the profiteers continue to exploit us. I also think that this is a moment for deep base building and political education. People are suffering and in so much pain right now. And I think our project as organizers is to transform that personal pain into public power. And the way we do that is through deep political education about why things are the way they are and whose fault it is and what we can do moving forward. And then I also think, as well as local models, we need to put pressure on our elected officials, as disconnected as they may be, to do the things, to enact the vision that we need. What we've seen in the last couple months is the federal government printed over $2 trillion at the drop of a hat, right? Like, the federal government has the money to do the things that we're talking about at the scale that we need them to be done today. They are just failing to do so because of the lack of political will and the lack of political courage. That's not right, and we need to continue mounting pressure at the local, state, and federal level to make sure that our demands are met.
Thank all three of you for being on this panel today. Wonderful discussion. I dropped my contact information in the chat. Please feel free to follow up with any of us on the panel. This was, and just again, I can't thank you enough for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, badass panelists. And Isaiah.
Thank you.
Good job. Thank you. Bye.